Thank you very much. Can I say that I think entirely behind David on the subject of bitcoins, and it's not something I really claim to have understood or really like. So whereas this says decentralized security, you mustn't mistake anything I'm going to say as being in support of Bitcoin per se. I find myself a little bit out of my normal comfort zone here today, because normally I give talks on highly technical mathematical things. I've had to get at all the symbols from this talk, which of course is alarming to me, but not to you. Normally it's safely uncontroversial what I talk about. Now, when Leon asked me to talk about payment beyond Snowden, I thought, now there's a controversial subject for me to talk about. So I set about writing the least controversial talk I could think of on a controversial subject. But I find that, having listened to you all talk today, perhaps it's become controversial from a slightly different angle from what I had feared initially. So I ought to explain who I am, first of all, because as I said, I'm not sort of the normal sort of person in this room. I'm a computer scientist. I'm an expert in computer security, but definitely not a conventional expert in payment. I'm not an expert in the sort of cryptography that lies behind Bitcoin, although I will admit, as David said, that I admire it. I've admired that sort of aspect of cryptography and its ingenious use for years, but as David said, that doesn't mean to say one necessarily admires the concept. I thought I'd better lay my cards on the line in talking about Snowden, to say that I've got no axe to grind either way at all on the subject of Snowden. I count myself there as a sort of interested and perhaps intelligent observer of the situation. I've worked for many years with people from the secret world, and I say there, and find them all to be, at least all the people I work with, to be wonderful, largely extremely talented scientists and altruistic people. But I'm certainly not part of that world myself. And as I hope to get a little bit of time to talk about later on, I'm a developer of some ideas in payment security, which of course is why I find myself here today. The subject I work in, computer security, is a fascinating area of mathematics or of computer science, because one is handling the adversary, one's handling the person who's trying to hack you. And I like this cartoon or this illustration of some Victorian technology for projecting ghosts onto stages. If you look, the person in the orchestra pit, so to speak, is playing a ghost, but he's been projected onto the stage by this piece of angled glass on top of him. And I found this illustrates the ideas behind a lot of security, and actually to some extent the sort of solutions I invent in security quite well, in the sense that one is creating an image of something that isn't really there in order to fool people. So you see the guy playing the ghost in the bottom. The ghost appears to be where the ghost actually is shown in the picture, but he's sort of put there by the glass, folded over. And easy to be deceived into something is secure when it isn't. And a lot of people make a lot of mistakes in designing supposedly secure systems. Now, I gather there aren't really very many experts in computer security today, because I haven't actually had any serious engagement with the issue, but perhaps I can illustrate one or two aspects of this during my talk. But I'm also going to talk about the sort of the data issues behind Snowden. So let's think about the post-Snowden world. I think anybody with any sense would have realised the sort of things, not in detail, but in generality, that Snowden allegedly revealed to the world were in fact going on. It didn't come as a great surprise to very many well-informed people, shall we say. Maybe the details did, but not the generality. However, even though one might have suspected this, I think it's true to say that knowing, at least essentially knowing that it's true, does change things in so many ways. People are less likely to trust organisations to manage security for them. or to protect their information, because they can see the government not doing it very well. I mean, frankly, I find more horrific than the idea of what the government's doing, which I frankly find that horrific myself. I find it horrific that they managed to let go this number of secrets. And that Bradley through Chelsea Manning did more or less exactly the same thing. I mean, how can the government lose two such large amounts of vital information? It must mean they're not very good at handling this sort of stuff. So we certainly perhaps ought to be more alarmed about them collecting it in the first place. And perhaps we also ought to be alarmed about the payment industry collecting information. I think perhaps one serious consequence of the Snowden revelations is that those creating computer security solutions are less likely to believe government authorities or government-inspired standards, or standards where government has played a part in the drafting, in what represents a secure system. And I think that the fact that people don't trust them and might therefore use other systems is possibly more dangerous than the perhaps consequence of these being insecure in the first place, or partially insecure. But I find it very hard to tell between that particular balance. And certainly if I were, as I do, designing supposedly secure systems, I would think very carefully about which standards to follow. And people will believe, even more so than they did before, and perhaps correctly, that authorities do not want them to have too many secrets. They don't want them to have too much security from them. And perhaps the serious issue is that the degree of revelation might well affect the degree of liability. If you're an organisation and something about government action reveals your secrets to the world, then perhaps somebody might, post-Snowden, be more reasonable in suing you for not having realised this was a possibility. Let's look briefly at security issues in payment. Parties need to authenticate each other. In other words, the payer and the payee need to make sure that they're talking to the person they think they're talking to. The banks need to identify the payer and the payee. And the payer and the payee need to identify the banks, and the banks need to identify each other. All these parties need to know they're talking to each other. And once they have established this, they still need to maintain the secrecy and integrity of the transaction data while it's happening. It's undesirable, clearly, as part of a transaction, although it clearly still happens a great deal, even with new technologies, to share secret information with those who don't need it. For example, credit card numbers. Just to give you a personal and a news revelation about this, as has been said before, in Europe for many years we've used chip and pin, which, although an imperfect technology, is certainly better than handing your credit card to somebody and letting them swipe it or taking a copy of it or whatever in the traditional American system. And indeed, when I was in Oregon last year, I had my credit card details stolen. And so I lost my Amex card for a while. But I was horrified to see a news headline today that some, I think it's British, payday loan company has now mandates that its customers hand over to them their internet banking passwords. This was in the Times of London today. I read it online, and I've been collecting some interesting stories for this. And this would seem to me to say that they're mandating that their customers breach their terms of agreement with the banks. This is just absurd, isn't it? What's been increasingly apparent to me viewing today is that payment information, shall we say, of a non-intrinsically secret nature is essentially the commodity that most of you here are dealing with. And yet, as I think Mike Abbott said this morning, this is certainly something which people might reasonably worry about in terms of privacy issues, as we shall perhaps see in a moment. But perhaps to deal finally with the post-Snowden issue, I hope and believe that there should be no direct impact of Snowden on payment security per se, unless the issue of standards that I talked about earlier on somehow comes into play. A much greater potential impact on privacy, since clearly the government is interested very much in our information, but then so clearly are corporations very much interested in our information. Perhaps it's therefore mainly related to the general issue of who controls, has access to, and can use data about us all. And I think that this is clearly one of the greatest challenges of modern society. And I think that if many people, should we say, out there in the real world could have heard some of the things that are being said here today about how their information is being traded, they might well ask questions. As I said, I've been collecting some news stories. That one from the Times I didn't get a chance to put in the talk because it was too new. But I like this top one, the unintentional Amazon guide to dealing drugs. Amazon, the corporate entity, doesn't actually produce a guide for dealing drugs, but its purchase recommendation algorithm sure seems to have done just that. This was a headline from the press last week, because if you buy digital scales, that obviously for low weights, it suggests drug paraphernalia as things you might alternatively buy.
Yeah, well, they're in Washington State, which is decriminalized pot.
It could be. Frankly, if I was drug dealing, I wouldn't buy anything publicly over Amazon. But it does show the way in which interesting things can emerge from the handling of data. Another headline from last week is that the UK version of the IRS, namely Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, announced last week that it was going to sell anonymised tax data. So it was going to take away your names and all obvious identifying features from people's tax data and sell it to people who were looking for sort of demographic, financial information about the population. This is very similar to a slightly older issue about health information coming from the British National Health Service. But of course the problem there is that anonymisation is a very imperfect process. If you identify a particular record of somebody, and especially somebody who is in some way untypical in terms of their health profile or financial profile, it's actually going to be very easy to unmask all the details about them if you know partial information about them. And so people, I think, are rightly getting very cautious about how information is handled. And clearly, all the information that we're talking about today in terms of payment could be viewed very similarly. Anyway, let's look at some particular technology. Sort of the technology I think everybody's been looking at today. Let's imagine I've got a payer and a payee. I don't particularly care for this purpose whether it's a peer-to-peer payment or whether the payee is a shop. Just about all, it's very easy to solve the problem in terms of computer security, of how to securely connect banks to each other. It's also very easy, in terms of established security technology, to make sure that your phone is connected securely to your bank, because we have protocols like SSL, which is a well-established cryptographic protocol, which does this very effectively. It's less easy, and very few technologies seem to do this, should we say, in a completely easy and secure way of getting a 100% secure authenticated link between the payer and the payee, which is obviously what I called earlier, and I think I called it earlier, an ad hoc problem. In other words, instead of creating a permanent link with your bank, you've got to create a sort of ephemeral link, in many cases, with the person you're trying to pay. And what I'm going to argue is that many problems in payment can, to some extent, be solved or ameliorated if you could really get that link to work well and securely, and especially in a way which the payer trusts. So I'm going to identify that thin line on the left as what I call the missing link. I think I've more or less said all that. It would be very useful to have such a link, secure and guaranteed, in order to conduct payment securely. So, for example, an attempt to do this, or a partial solution to this, is provided by NFC, of course. NFC gives you some degree of security, and it gives you some degree of authentication, but NFC is, in all various I've seen, subject to some degree of insecurity, some degree of man-in-the-middle attack, because just because you're close to something doesn't mean to say nobody else is as well. Or just because you're close to the till doesn't mean to say nobody else is close to you taking your money as well, for example. Or you may be close to the till and not intended to give your money, but it takes it anyway. There was quite a well-published story in the UK last year about Marks and Spencer's, a very large and reputable British retailer, whose NFC payment machines seem to be taking money randomly from any NFC card that happens to be close to the money. So what can that missing link do for us? If we could get a secure connection between the payer and the payee, then perhaps we wouldn't have to limit the value of transactions in the way that NFC typically does. There'd be no need to transfer information manually either way. Obviously, you still have to give your details to your bank, as some of the technologies we've seen today have shown, in order to authenticate yourself to it, and you presumably still have to approve the particular payment. And the more bandwidth you've got on that link, which would be easy with just about any technology for a link, it would be easy to prevent your information about your personal information about yourself, certainly your credit card number, but also potentially even your identity, going to the payee. In some sense, you could give the payment as many of the characteristics of cash as you like. I rather like cash as a payment method. I mean, in the sense that your loss is completely limited to the amount of money you hand over, and potentially you give away no information unless you want to, and potentially both parties are anonymous. And all of this can be achieved if you've got the right sort of technology for achieving that link. Of course, we might have to share details because of regulation or because of commercial decisions, as obviously so many people are keen on having. But what one would like is a solution where there is no need to do so in order to achieve transaction security or in order to achieve the transaction itself. So in other words, one would like to make such choices optional and things that a particular technology could decide to do or not, or a particular customer could decide to do or not within a given technology. The title of this talk was basically decentralized security, so I want to make a distinction between centralized and decentralized security. Traditional security is based upon centralized authorities for managing keys, identities, and rights. And these typically use mechanisms such as public key infrastructures, which are basically hierarchical central identity servers. You connect to parties based upon their names. These names are probably not human names, because human names are definitely not very unique. They might be Ethernet addresses, which is not very human convenient. They might, as we've seen in several examples today, be telephone numbers, which are slightly more human convenient, but still have to be typed in, or email addresses, ditto. The keys of a centralized authority are then used to manage the authentication, secrecy, and privacy. Centralized authority might just about carry trust problems in this post-Snowden world, or in a world where people start to distrust centralized authority. So it's possible they might be less happy to use them. I don't know. But I think that, personally, the idea I'm trying to get across here today is that the implications of Snowden are just one small part, in some sense, of the impact of data and the storage and use of data about individuals by by large organisations, whether they be governmental or commercial. On the other hand, in decentralised security, parties do not rely upon central authorities for joining them together securely, and nobody typically will get to know the information about keys, etc., or could know the information about keys, etc., other than the parties themselves. So to achieve decentralised security, they have to use the information they trade or their context, the situation in which the payment is happening, in other words, to give them security. So the best two examples of this are NFC, which I'm sure you all understand, and out-of-band channel, which is just a generalisation to some extent of NFC. An out-of-band channel means it's not quite a generalisation of NFC, but it's imagine you've got some high bandwidth channel between two parties, which is not secure, but you've got some other channel which could be NFC, or it could be human mediated, or lots of other things, which is more secure, which is usable in order to bolster security. And the idea here is that no one other than the connecting parties take part in any sense in a trusted way in such a interaction. So decentralized security is obviously appealing to the conspiracy theorist, somebody who doesn't want anybody to get to know what they're doing. And of course, there's nothing to say the conspiracy theorist isn't right, is there? And it's attractive when names are not meaningful. And after all, if you walk into a shop, then almost certainly you don't know their name and they don't know yours. So trying to connect by identities, therefore, is not, at least a small shop, is perhaps not an ideal context for centralized security. And so what I want to put forward as a thesis is that we should adopt something which I've termed reverse authentication. In other words, turning around the initial authentication in payment from what's normally done, which is where the system tries very hard to authenticate the payer, but the payer doesn't try very hard to make sure that they're connected to the right party, which of course may not be obvious in many cases. But of course, if we're going to use that missing link, which we can't see ourselves, the primary concern is that the payer knows that their money is going to the right place in the right transaction. And so what I argue is that the first step of authentication in a payment ought to be that the payer knows they're connected to the person they're trying to pay, and then using the connected link they then develop, they can expedite the rest of the authentication process and the authorization process for the payment. And if they want to, as I say, keep their personal information to themselves. I'll move on quickly to the end. My place in all of this is that I've spent the last 10 years building protocols for ad hoc authentication based upon out-of-band channels that are optimal in how much information, in how much authentication they give for a given transfer of information. They completely resist combinatorial attack in the sense that they effectively prove the absence of a man in the middle, except for a single lucky guess against the protocol, and they can be used over any mode of connection and over any medium. And you need no preloaded security information like a PKI in order to achieve it. Now, a lot of people have been working on this sort of technology, but given the particular nature of the technology that I have developed, I conceived of using this sort of technology to make the missing link in payment, and Oxford University having patented some of my initial protocols and subsequently patented aspects of using this sort of technology in payment, and has recently spun out a company called Oxcept to exploit that idea and other aspects of my work in ad hoc security. I carry on running my department, other people run the company, but anyway, here are my conclusions. I'll give you some contact details in a minute. Decentralized security can add significantly to payment security and make the sharing of information a more optional activity. And it enables some interesting new possibilities in payments. Now, if anybody would like, I hope that all the overheads for this conference are going to be shared around, because I personally found other people's talks extremely interesting, and I hope that you'll get mine as well, because in there I've given both some references to the technical work that lies behind this, and some contact details. So thanks very much.
Okay, we're going to break in the middle of this panel for a 10-minute coffee break. Please be back here promptly. We have 2 more speakers to wrap up this part of the presentation.